Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to tell you the story about a revival, actually the worst revival that we've ever had at one of my churches. But before I say that, I want to say this is a short devotion from the Littleton United Methodist Church. To be honest, I really wasn't very excited about this revival. I mean, back in that day, it seemed like every evangelical church had to have some sort of revival service every spring and every fall. I kind of had a different idea at the time. At the time, I thought that we should target and have intentionality to our services. That is, that if we wanted to do a revival, it didn't matter what time of year it was, we should do it. And that we should not have a revival if we don't have a reason for it. With this particular season, we had a revival scheduled and the speaker canceled out. So we went looking with just a week or so to go. We went looking for someone. We already had the revival advertised, and I kind of wanted to call it off, but we found another speaker that was a dynamite speaker, and so we called this person to ask if he could come and speak to us for our revival service. And of course he said no, because dynamite speakers tend to book up way in advance. But he did tell us about this guy that was a church planter, a godly person, had already planted several different Christian churches on in different countries. And we thought, boy, we're lucky he just happened to have a free time. So we asked the person if he would come and if he would share with us. That probably was a mistake. The services were scheduled to start on a Sunday morning, followed up by that Sunday night, and then go out throughout the rest of the next week. We thought if we started on a Sunday morning, we could start with a bang, and people would get to hear our guest speaker, and it would draw them back. I first realized that we were in trouble following the morning service, when I was shaking hands with people, and there were some visitors that had been at church, and I overheard some of the people in our church going to a visitor and saying, "It's okay. It's not always like this. He's a guest speaker. The pastor will be back next week." And something inside of me went like, uh-oh, this isn't going to go well. And I was right. It didn't go well. There were much fewer people than I expected on Sunday night. And by Monday night, there was nobody. There were a few people. There were the musicians that we had hired, especially for that revival series, because we spent some money and hired a band to come and be worship leaders. And then there were a couple of ladies that sat on the left side of the church up toward the front, but you couldn't drive them away. And then there was Sue, my wife, and myself, and our kids. And on Monday night, our kids were like, "Ted, please, please, please don't make us go back." And I felt a little sorry. They were the preacher's kids. They should be there, but I didn't really want to go back either. And by Tuesday night, we nearly lost the band. They called me aside and they said, "Look, There's nobody here. This isn't working out. We're just going to go home. And I kept them the whole week by promising them that if they would come and they would play to nobody, well, my wife, myself, these two ladies, and my kids, that I would have them back for a full concert and that we would blow it up really big and advertise it. And so they reluctantly stayed, but their heart really wasn't in it. And so Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, on in toward the weekend, we would come. The musicians would play to nobody. The speaker would get up and speak fairly long, quite long, fairly dry, quite dry. And I would think to myself, oh, this isn't going so well. So on and on it went. Toward the end of the week, on Thursday or Friday, looks like I'm stirring up my neighbor's dog. I think I'll go inside. Well, this is not as scenic as the stump, but I don't have to compete with on the other side of the fence. So I guess we'll carry on the story. Where were we? Oh, yes. I was starting, and on it went through the week. Didn't get much better. Weren't many people left to lose. Can't remember if I lost my kids or not. At least I stayed. The musicians stayed. So, toward the end of the week, Thursday, Friday, something like that, I had an appointment out of town with a bunch of other clergy, some clergy zone meeting, and so I took my guest with me. I mean, he was quite an accomplished Christian. And so we were riding the car across the miles to the other town, and I got to know him a little better, and he was a man of incredible depth. He was a mature Christian. If his primary gift was not in the pulpit, it certainly was with people. He was a man that knew how to pray. I mean, he was the real deal. And he knew he wasn't a great speaker. And so as we're riding, young me, I took me a long time to gather the courage, and I'm, driving, and we're talking, and sometime during the conversation, I kind of look over a little bit, and I'm like, so you planted a bunch of churches, several churches. Yeah, he had. You planted them on several different countries, at least 3 different countries. And yeah, he had. And you're in a church plant right now. And yes, he was. And you're already starting to have plans to plant another one? Yes, he was. And so I couldn't really stop the car, but I tried not to be too, derogatory. But it was just a burning question in me. And so I was like, how'd you do it? And in my mind I was thinking, because you can't preach. Well, that's when he answered my question. And that was the moment that the worst revival ever in the history of my church, one of my churches, became the best revival that I was ever in. So let me tell you. He told me that day, on that car ride, that he knew he was not a great speaker. He knew how to pray. Boy, did he know how to pray. He knew how to work with people. He knew how to organize and lead. And the way he built so many churches was that he didn't do it alone. He came into a town and he got a Bible study organized and he got people organized and he led people to Christ. And then he brought in one of his best friends, who was the other evangelist, the speaker, who was so booked up we couldn't get him. And now I'm glad we didn't get him, because I needed to hear this guy. But this guy would come in, and this guy's main gift was preaching. He was a dynamic preacher. He held people's attention and brought them to Christ, and the church began to grow and grow and grow, and it got organized and stable and solid. And then when it got solid, his friend would start scouting for another place, and so he would go off and start the very same thing again in a new town. And once it got to the right place, they would hand the old church over to another pastor that was able to take it from there, and the dynamic speaker would go to the next town. And you see, who knows what God has planned? But I, to this day, don't think that God brought that speaker for that church, my church. I think God brought that speaker for my church's pastor. It wasn't the church that needed a new shot in the arm. It was their pastor. Me. And what I needed to know was, there really is no place in the Christian church for Lone Rangers. I had always been kind of a maverick, a Lone Ranger. I would think to the rest of the churches and conference, you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. That's not how God intends for the church to work. I started looking through the Bible to see if I was correct, and I was correct. Peter and the new leaders of the early church, they brought Timothy and others with them. Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2. Moses had Aaron and Miriam, and later Joshua. And even in those rare instances where ministry was not a team ministry in the Bible, like Joseph in prison, that was an act of God to keep Joseph strong more than it was a badge of honor that Joseph's there. In the Babylonian exile, Daniel had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In prison, Paul said, call John Mark and have him come. And when my oldest son was born, Jeremy, way back all those decades ago, I could see that America was becoming less and less and less Christian all the time. And I thought to myself, I want a son that can stand up for himself in a world that's becoming more and more antagonistic to the Christian faith. And so I named him Jeremiah, after the weeping prophet that stood alone in the nation and before an apostate nation of Israel and spoke the word of God with courage. Now, back in that day when my first son was born, I knew Jeremiah's life and admired Jeremiah, but I didn't know about Baruch. Do you know Baruch? Baruch was Jeremiah's scribe, his secretary. That is, when Jeremiah wrote something, Baruch wrote it down. Even Jeremiah wasn't alone. Oh, in Hebrew, the word Baruch, it means blessed, blessed. So every day when Jeremiah is standing alone, he goes and he dictates his notes to the person that he calls blessed, his partner in the work of God. You and I weren't designed to be Lone Rangers. We were designed to work as a part of the body of Christ. I've never forgotten that revival. It changed my whole ministry, changed my life, helped me grow up a little, which is what God had planned the whole time. It's my prayer that this little devotional is helpful to somebody. Maybe it's helpful to you. If so, we would like to know. Leave a comment. Give us a like. If it's on YouTube, you might want to subscribe. We do this about once a week, usually the middle of the week. If it's on Facebook, you might join our Littleton United Methodist Church page. Either way, I hope that God watches over you through the remainder of this week and that you don't have to run that race alone. But if, like Joseph, you have to, I know God is there and you're even not alone then.